fingers clamped Jonas Hale's sleeve before the ranch door finished opening. Cold beads pressed into his palm, metal and leather tangled together. The Apache woman stood steady in the pale dawn wind. Her hands lifted the small bundle toward Jonas Hale's chest. Inside, a child's wooden rattle carved with his own ranch brand. Jonas felt the old scar in his ribs tighten like winter wire. "You remember this mark?" the woman whispered, eyes steady as sunrise. Jonas Hale stopped breathing, because that rattle belonged to the son he buried. Leather scraped the porch rail as Jonas Hale leaned his weight against it. The old boards answered with a tired creak that echoed through the empty yard. Wind moved across the ranch slow and dry, combing dust through the broken fence lines. No cattle. No voices. Just the loose chain on the well tapping metal against wood. Clink. Pause. Clink. Jonas watched the gray morning crawl over the hills like something reluctant to live. 10 years of dawns had looked exactly the same. Cold night. Empty land. A house with one chair always pushed too far from the table. His hand rested on the porch post where a child once carved crooked lines with a pocket knife. The marks were still there. Small. Uneven. The wind shifted. Hooves moved somewhere beyond the cottonwoods. Slow. Careful. Jonas straightened, boots thudding once against the boards. Dust drifted down the road like pale smoke. A lone rider. Buckskin. Dark braids moving against the rising light. The horse stopped before the gate with a tired snort. Leather creaked as the rider slid down. Jonas did not step forward. Did not speak. The ranch had not welcomed strangers in 10 years. The gate hinges groaned as the woman pushed through. Each step across the yard sounded soft but steady in the dirt. Boot. Step. Boot. Step. She stopped at the foot of the porch. For a moment the wind filled the silence between them. The loose well chain tapped again. Clink. Scrape. Clink. Her hands lifted slowly. Something small rested in her palms. Wood. Smooth with age. A child's rattle carved from pale cedar. The handle carried a burned cattle mark. Jonas Hale's brand. His breath stalled in his chest. The woman stepped closer, boots pressing the dust flat beneath her weight. The rattle moved once. A dry wooden knock against her fingers. Doc. Doc. Jonas felt his ribs tighten where the old scar lived beneath his shirt. His voice came out rough from long disuse. "That brand belongs to my boy." The woman's dark eyes held steady in the pale dawn. "He lived," she said quietly. Wind slipped through the porch boards. The rattle sounded again. Doc. Doc. Then her knees buckled. The cedar toy struck Jonas's palm as she fell forward. Her weight sagged against his chest. Boots scraped the porch floor as he caught her. For a long second he stood frozen with the rattle pressed in his hand. The empty house breathed behind him. Floorboards creaked softly in the wind. Jonas Hale turned at last. The door groaned open. And the stranger crossed the threshold into a home that had been silent for 10 years. The door shut behind Jonas Hale with a dull wooden thud. Cold morning air slipped away as the house swallowed the silence again. Dust drifted through the pale light from the window. Jonas carried the Apache woman across the narrow room. Her weight felt lighter than it should. Too light. Boot heels thumped softly against the floorboards. The boards answered with a low tired creak. 10 years of quiet had settled deep into this house. The iron stove crouched cold against the wall. Jonas lowered the woman onto the narrow bed beside it. The mattress sighed beneath her. Her braids slid across the blanket like dark rope. Her face looked gray beneath the dust of the road. Jonas stood there a moment. The cedar rattle still rested in his palm. Doc. The small beads inside struck the wood. The sound crawled through the room like an old memory. Jonas closed his fist around it. The stove door groaned open. Ash scraped metal as he shoved kindling inside. A match scratched. Flame licked the wood. The stove breathed slowly. Then stronger. Heat began pushing the cold back from the room. The woman stirred faintly. Her breath rasped thin against the blanket. Jonas poured water from the iron kettle. The cup clinked softly against the table. He crouched beside the bed. Her eyes opened halfway. Dark. Steady. Not afraid. "You rode far," Jonas said. Her voice came slow. 3 days without stopping. The stove popped sharply behind them. Firelight touched the walls. Jonas studied her face. "You knew my name." The woman did not answer. Her eyes drifted toward his hand. The cedar rattle. Jonas followed her gaze. Doc. The sound struck again as his grip loosened. Her fingers lifted weakly toward it. Then stopped. "Later," she whispered. Jonas set the rattle on the table beside the bed. The wood tapped the surface once. The sound echoed strangely in the quiet room. Outside, wind dragged along the roof shingles. The loose well chain answered. Clink. Pause. Clink. The woman's eyes closed again. Sleep pulled her down fast. Jonas stepped back from the bed. Fire warmed the room now. Not much, but enough to soften the morning cold. He moved toward the window. Dust rolled across the yard in thin waves. The ranch stretched empty toward the hills. Fence posts leaned tired in the wind. Nothing moved. Jonas turned back toward the bed. The woman's breathing had deepened. Slow. Steady. Alive. A faint scraping sound came from the doorway. Jonas stiffened. Leather shifted under his hand. The rifle leaned against the wall beside the door. His fingers wrapped around the stock. The scraping came again. Soft. Small. Jonas stepped into the hall. Boot heels pressed quietly into the boards. The sound came from the front room. Something moved near the door. He pushed the rifle barrel forward and stepped through. Sunlight poured across the floorboards. Dust floated through it like pale smoke. The door stood slightly open. Wind nudged it wider with a dull wooden knock. But something else moved near the threshold. Jonas lowered the rifle slowly. A child stood there. Small. Thin. Curly hair full of road dust. Bare feet pale against the boards. The boy stared at him with wide, steady eyes. In his hand rested a strip of leather. At the end of the leather hung a small wooden piece. Another cedar rattlehead. Broken from the handle. The boy lifted it slightly. Doc. The hollow knock sounded again. Jonas felt the breath leave his chest. "You came with her," Jonas said quietly. The boy nodded once. His voice came thin from thirst. "Mother said wait outside." Jonas glanced toward the bedroom. The woman still slept. The boy swayed slightly where he stood. The wind pushed the door open wider. Cold air slid across the floor. The boy shivered. Jonas set the rifle against the wall. His voice came rough. "Close the door." The boy obeyed. Wood met wood with a quiet thud. Silence settled again. The stove popped once in the other room. Jonas walked to the table. A small loaf of bread sat wrapped in cloth. He tore a piece and handed it to the boy. The child took it slowly. Eyes watching Jonas the whole time. He ate like someone who had not seen food in days. Small careful bites. Jonas poured water from the kettle. The tin cup clinked softly against the table. The boy drank until the cup emptied. Outside the wind carried a distant sound. Hooves. Far off. Too far to see yet. But real. Jonas moved toward the window again. Dust shifted along the road beyond the cottonwoods. Nothing visible. Still. The sound had been there. He felt it in his bones. The boy's voice broke the silence. "Mother said you would help." Jonas looked down at him. "Your mother says many things." The boy held up the broken rattle piece again. "Doc. The sound landed soft but sharp in the room. "She said this would make you listen." Jonas stared at the cedar wood. The burn mark across it. His own brand. A memory pressed hard against his ribs. The stove cracked loudly behind them. Fire climbing stronger now. Warmth spreading through the house that had lived in cold for years. Jonas exhaled slowly. "Your name," he said. "Thomas." The name hung in the air. Heavy. Jonas turned away before the boy could see his face. He walked back toward the bedroom. The floorboards creaked under his steps. Inside, the woman stirred again. Her eyes opened slowly. She saw Jonas. Then the warmth of the fire. Then the faint sound behind him. "Doc. Doc." The broken rattle knocking softly in the child's hand. Her eyes closed again with quiet relief. Jonas stood beside the bed. Cold still lived in the corners of the room. But the fire kept growing. And the house was no longer silent. Morning light slipped through the thin curtains. Soft. Pale. It rested on the wooden floor beside the stove. The fire had burned low in the night. Ash shifted inside the iron belly. A faint crackle answered the cold creeping back into the room. Jonas Hale sat in the chair near the window. Boots planted wide. Hands still. He had not slept. Across the room, the boy slept curled beneath a wool blanket. Small breaths. Steady. The cedar rattle rested beside his hand. "Doc." A small accidental knock as his fingers moved in sleep. The sound slid through Jonas like a cold knife. He looked away. Outside, dawn dragged slowly across the ranch. Frost clung to the fence rails. The wind had gone quiet. Too quiet. Jonas stood. Floorboards creaked under his weight. He moved to the stove. Iron groaned as he opened the door. Wood scraped. A match struck. Flame caught slowly. The fire breathed again. Warmth began pushing against the cold. Behind him, the bedroom door opened with a soft wooden sigh. The Apache woman stepped into the room. Her steps were careful. Weak. But steady. Jonas glanced once. "You should still be resting." Her voice came low but clear. "Rest is finished." She stood beside the stove. Firelight warmed the dust on her face. Color had returned to her cheeks. Jonas poured water from the kettle. Steam rose in thin ribbons. The tin cup clicked gently against the table. She took it with both hands. Held it close. Warmth soaking into her fingers. The boy stirred under the blanket. Eyes opening slowly. He saw the woman and sat up fast. "Mother." She knelt beside him. Blanket rustled softly. Her hand brushed dust from his hair. "You waited." He nodded. "I did not move." Jonas watched from the stove. The fire cracked sharply. Sound filling the quiet house. The boy reached for the cedar rattle. "Doc." The sound bounced once against the wall. Jonas flinched before he could stop it. The woman noticed. Her eyes lifted toward him. "You remember the sound?" Jonas said nothing. He stepped to the window again. Outside, the ranch stretched empty under pale sky. But far beyond the fence line something moved. Dust. Thin. Rising slowly along the distant trail. Jonas narrowed his eyes. Could be wind. Could be riders. The boy's voice carried behind him. "Mother says you used to laugh." Jonas turned slightly. "I used to have reasons." The boy held up the rattle. "Doc. Doc." Mother said this would bring them back. The words hung in the room. Heavy. Jonas looked away again. Outside the dust line had vanished. Maybe wind. Maybe not. The woman rose slowly from the floor. Her legs wavered once. Jonas stepped forward without thinking. His hand caught her elbow. Warm skin under worn buckskin. She steadied. Did not pull away. "Thank you," she said quietly. Jonas released her arm. The stove popped again. Fire climbing stronger. The house slowly filling with heat. She studied the room. The empty shelves. The single chair by the table. The second chair pushed far into the corner. Unused. Her hand rested briefly on its back. You buried much silence here. Jonas leaned against the wall. Silence keeps things simple. The boy stood now. Bare feet touching the warm floorboards near the stove. He moved carefully toward the table. Hands exploring the room. Curious. Alive. He touched the chair. Pulled it closer to the table. Wood scraped softly across the floor. The sound filled the room like a small rebellion. Jonas watched him. Did not stop him. The boy climbed into the chair. Small boots dangling above the floor. He looked proud. The woman's eyes softened. Outside the wind returned. A low breath moving across the valley. Somewhere far off a horse whinnied. Jonas heard it instantly. His head turned toward the door. The sound came again. Faint. Distant. But real. The boy heard nothing. He tapped the rattle lightly against the table. Doc. Doc. Jonas stepped outside onto the porch. Cold air struck his face. The yard lay empty. Fence posts standing crooked against the morning light. The wind moved grass in long slow waves. But beyond the cottonwoods he saw something again. Dust rising along the road. A rider this time. Maybe two. Still far. But coming. Jonas stood there a long moment. The porch boards creaked under his weight. Behind him the house made a new sound. Small laughter. Light. The boy's voice. Followed by the rattle tapping again. Doc. Doc. Jonas closed his eyes briefly. Then stepped back inside. The door shut with a dull wooden thud. Warmth wrapped around him again. The boy looked up from the table. You have horses? Jonas nodded once. In the north pasture. The boy's eyes brightened. Will you show me? Jonas hesitated. Just a second. The woman watched him quietly. No pressure. No plea. Just patience. The stove popped. Fire throwing orange light across the room. Jonas exhaled slowly. After you eat. The boy grinned. The sound of that grin filled the house louder than the fire. Outside the wind carried distant hoofbeats closer. But inside the ranch house, warmth kept growing. And the cedar rattle tapped softly against the table. Doc. Doc. A sound Jonas Hale had not heard in 10 years. Morning stretched across the ranch in pale gold. Frost cracked under Jonas Hale's boots as he crossed the yard. Cold air moved through the fence rails with a low whisper. Behind him, the house door creaked open. Small footsteps followed. Thomas stepped onto the porch wrapped in Jonas's spare coat. The sleeves hung long past his hands. His breath puffed white in the cold. Jonas glanced back. You stay close. The boy nodded quickly. Yes, sir. The gate hinges groaned as Jonas pushed them open. The north pasture spread wide beyond the hill. Thin grass rattled softly under the wind. A small herd of horses lifted their heads at Jonas's approach. Leather creaked as he rested his hand on the fence rail. Thomas climbed beside him. Eyes wide. Are they yours? Jonas nodded once. They were. One gray mare stepped forward. Her hooves thudded gently against the frozen ground. Jonas whistled low. The sound slid across the pasture like an old habit. The mare answered with a soft snort. Thomas laughed. The sound startled Jonas more than the horse. It rang bright in the cold air. Jonas opened the gate. The metal latch scraped loudly. Come slow. Thomas walked beside him through the pasture grass. The mare approached with careful steps. Jonas laid a hand along her neck. Warm breath steamed from her nostrils. Thomas reached out. small fingers brushing the horse's mane. The animal shifted, then settled. Thomas smiled wide. "She likes me." Jonas said nothing, but he watched the boy closely. The wind carried a distant sound across the valley. Faint. A low thud of hooves. Jonas lifted his head. The horses noticed it too, ears turning toward the southern ridge. Jonas scanned the horizon. Dust flickered along the far trail. Too far to see clearly, but riders moved there. Jonas closed the pasture gate again. Metal clanged against wood. Back to the house. Thomas looked up. "Already?" "Yes." The boy obeyed without complaint. Their boots crunched through frost as they walked. Behind them the horses shifted nervously. The wind carried the faint rhythm again. Hooves. Steady. Coming closer. Inside the ranch house the stove burned strong. Warm air pushed the cold from the walls. Mara stood by the window. Her braids hung loose over her shoulders. She watched the horizon without blinking. Jonas stepped inside. The door shut with a dull thud. "You saw them," she said quietly. Jonas removed his gloves. "Too far yet?" "But coming." He did not answer. The stove cracked sharply. Flames licking higher. Thomas rushed to the table. The cedar rattle rested there. He picked it up. Doc. Doc. The sound bounced lightly through the room. Mara's eyes softened when she heard it. Jonas turned away. He poured water into a tin basin. Steam curled upward. Mara moved to help Thomas wash his hands. Warm water splashed softly. The boy laughed when it tickled his fingers. The small sounds filled the house again. Water. Fire. Breath. Life. Jonas leaned against the wall. For a moment the ranch felt different. Less empty. The boy finished washing and climbed into the chair. Boot heels knocking the wood lightly. Jonas cut bread from the loaf. The knife scraped the board. Crust cracked under the blade. Thomas watched every movement. Hungry eyes. Jonas slid the plate across the table. "Eat." The boy obeyed. Small bites. Fast at first. Then slower. Warmth crept into his cheeks. Mara sat across from him. Her gaze drifted to the window again. Outside the wind changed direction. The loose well chain tapped against the post. Clink. Pause. Clink. Jonas heard something beneath that sound. Hooves again. Closer now. He stepped to the door and opened it. Cold air pushed into the room. The valley lay white and bright under the sun. Dust moved clearly now along the southern trail. 3 riders. Maybe 4. Still distant. But no longer a question. Jonas shut the door slowly. The latch clicked. Inside the warmth held steady. The boy tapped the rattle again while chewing. Doc. Doc. Jonas looked at the brand burned into the cedar handle. His brand. His past. The sound pressed against his chest like an old wound reopening. Mara's voice came soft behind him. "They will not stop." Jonas nodded once. "I know." The stove popped sharply again. Firelight flickered across the walls. Thomas finished the last piece of bread. He held the rattle up proudly. "Listen. Doc. Doc." The sound filled the house again. Warm. Alive. But outside, beyond the fence line, the riders kept coming. And the wind carried their hoofbeats closer with every mile. The wind changed before noon. Jonas Hale felt it through the porch boards. A dry push from the south. The kind that carried dust. And riders. He stood beside the hitch rail with one hand resting on the post. The ranch lay quiet. Too quiet. Inside the house the stove breathed steadily. Warmth pressed against the window glass. A small sound drifted out through the door. Doc. Doc. The cedar rattle. Jonas closed his eyes briefly, then opened them toward the road. Dust moved along the far ridge again. Clear now. 4 riders spread wide across the trail. They rode slow. Not travelers. Hunters. Leather creaked as Jonas stepped down from the porch. His boots struck the ground with dull thuds. The gate chain rattled softly in the wind. Clink. Pause. Clink. Behind him the door opened. Mara stepped onto the porch. Her gaze followed his. She saw the dust. Her shoulders tightened. "They found us." Jonas did not answer. He walked toward the well and pulled the bucket up. Rope rasped against wood. Water sloshed in the pail. Simple work. Steady work. The kind a man did when trouble was still miles away. But coming. The riders crested the ridge. Sunlight flashed against metal. Gun barrels. Spurs. Jonas set the bucket down beside the trough. Water splashed quietly. Inside the house the rattle sounded again. Doc. Doc. The riders heard it too. One of them laughed. The sound carried across the valley. Cold. Mocking. The lead rider pushed his horse through the ranch gate. Hinges shrieked against rust. The others followed. Hooves thudded against the packed dirt yard. Jonas stood still beside the well. Hands empty. Eyes steady. The lead rider wore a black coat and a wide gray hat. A silver watch chain hung across his vest. He looked around the ranch slowly. Then down at Jonas. "You Jonas Hale?" Jonas nodded once. "That depends who's asking." The rider smiled thinly. "Name's Cutter." His horse shifted under him. Leather creaked. "We ride for Victor Crowley." The name landed heavy in the air. Mara stepped down from the porch behind Jonas. Her boots scraped the dirt. Cutter noticed her instantly. His smile widened. "Well now." His gaze slid across her braids. "Didn't expect to see Apache company here." Jonas moved one step sideways. Blocking the porch. Blocking the door. Inside the rattle sounded again. "Doc. Doc." Cutter's eyes flicked toward the house. "What's that sound?" Jonas shrugged. "Wind knocking wood." One of the riders laughed again. "Sounds like a toy." Cutter tilted his head. "You got children here, Hale?" Jonas's voice stayed flat. "No." Silence settled across the yard. Cold and tight. The wind dragged dust between the horse's legs. Cutter leaned forward in the saddle. "Crowley owns this valley now." Jonas said nothing. Cutter continued. "Bought every acre from the county office last week." He pulled a folded paper from his coat. The document snapped in the wind. "Your name's on the list of men who forgot to leave." Jonas wiped his hands slowly on his trousers. "I've been here 20 years." Cutter shrugged. "Crowley's been here 1 week." He tapped the paper. "That's enough." The riders chuckled quietly. Inside the house a chair scraped the floor. Small. Careless. Jonas felt the sound like a hammer against his ribs. Cutter heard it too. His eyes sharpened. "Well now." He swung down from his saddle. Boots thudded into the dirt. Spurs jingled softly. He walked toward the porch. Jonas stepped forward. Blocking the path. The wind rattled the loose chain on the well. Clink. Clink. Cutter stopped 2 steps away. They stood eye to eye. "You hiding something in there, Hale?" Jonas's voice stayed calm. "Just a stove and a roof." Cutter leaned closer. His breath smelled of tobacco. "Crowley don't like secrets." Behind them one of the riders circled slowly through the yard. Hooves crunching gravel. The house door creaked faintly in the wind. Jonas felt Mara move behind him. Silent. Ready. Inside the rattle knocked softly again. "Doc. Doc." Cutter heard it clearly this time. His eyes narrowed. "That ain't the wind." Jonas said nothing. The yard went quiet except for the horses' breathing. Cutter stepped back slowly. He looked toward the house again. Then toward the hills. His smile returned. Cold. Patient. Well. He brushed dust from his gloves. "Crowley will want a personal visit." He mounted his horse again. Leather groaned. The other riders turned their animals toward the gate. Cutter paused before leaving. His gaze rested on Jonas. 3 days. His voice carried easily across the yard. "After that, this ranch belongs to Crowley." He looked once more toward the house. "And anything inside it." The riders pushed through the gate. Hooves pounding slowly down the trail. Dust rose behind them. The wind swallowed the sound little by little, until only silence remained. Jonas stood in the yard, watching, listening. The house creaked softly behind him. Warm air drifting from the doorway. Inside, the rattle sounded again. Doc. Doc. Not frightened. Not hurried. Just steady. Jonas turned toward the house. The sun had begun to sink behind the hills, and the valley no longer felt empty. It felt hunted. Evening crept across the valley slow and gray. Cold wind dragged through the fence posts and whispered across the yard. The ranch house glowed with low firelight through the window. Inside, the stove breathed warm air into the quiet room. Jonas Hale stood beside the table sharpening a knife. Steel scraped stone. Slow. Steady. SHHK. Pause. SHHK. Across the room, Thomas sat on the floor near the stove. The cedar rattle rested in his hands. Doc. Doc. The soft wooden sound mixed with the scrape of the blade. Mara stood by the window. Her eyes followed the darkening ridge. Watching. Always watching. Jonas stopped sharpening. The knife slid back into its sheath with a dull leather whisper. "You know Crowley," he said. Mara did not turn. "Yes." Her voice carried no fear. Only memory. Jonas leaned against the table. "Then start talking." The wind rattled the loose chain outside. Clink. Clink. Mara finally faced him. Firelight touched the lines of dust and travel on her face. "Crowley buys land with paper." Her voice stayed calm. "But he takes people with guns." Thomas looked up. The rattle tapped lightly against the floor. "Doc." Jonas glanced at the boy. Then back to Mara. "Why would he want you?" Mara shook her head. "Not me." Her gaze drifted to Thomas. The room fell quiet. Jonas followed her eyes slowly. The stove popped. Fire cracked loudly in the iron belly. "Explain," Jonas said. Mara stepped closer to the table. Her fingers rested on the wood. "Crowley's name sat heavy between them. He sent men to my village 2 winters ago." Her voice lowered. "They came for a child." Jonas frowned. "Why?" Mara did not answer immediately. Outside, the wind carried a faint sound across the valley. Hooves again. Far. But moving. Jonas stiffened slightly. Mara noticed. "They will come back tonight," she said. "Or tomorrow." Jonas crossed to the door and opened it. Cold air rushed inside. Darkness had settled across the valley. But far off, a faint lantern flickered along the southern road. A moving star in the night. Riders again. Jonas shut the door slowly. The latch clicked. Inside the house, warmth pressed back against the cold. Thomas stood and walked toward the table. The rattle tapped softly with each step. "Doc. Doc." Jonas watched him. The boy's hair caught the orange glow of the fire. For a moment the room felt strangely full. Alive. Jonas looked at Mara again. "You crossed half the territory to bring him here." "Yes." "Why me?" Mara reached slowly into the pouch of her belt. Leather creaked. She pulled out a small strip of saddle leather. Burned deep into it was a cattle brand. Jonas felt his chest tighten. His own mark. She placed the leather beside the rattle on the table. Doc. The rattle rolled once against it. Crowley knows this mark, she said. Jonas studied the brand. His voice came quieter now. That mark belongs to my family. Mara nodded. Crowley knows that too. Thomas touched the leather with careful fingers. Jonas stepped closer. What does Crowley want with it? Mara lifted her eyes. Power. The word hung in the room. Jonas waited. She continued slowly. Crowley's cattle empire spreads across 5 valleys. He wants the 6th. Jonas looked toward the window. The valley we're standing in. Mara nodded once. But the land cannot be claimed without the bloodline tied to this brand. Jonas frowned. What bloodline? Mara's gaze returned to Thomas. Silence pressed against the walls. The stove cracked loudly again. Fire leaping higher. Thomas lifted the rattle. Doc. Doc. The sound filled the room with strange weight. Jonas stared at the boy. Something inside his chest shifted. An old memory stirring. But he pushed it down. Crowley can take land with guns, Jonas said. He doesn't need bloodlines. Mara shook her head. He does. Outside the wind rose suddenly. It slammed against the door. The house groaned softly. Then came a distant gunshot. Sharp. Far away. Thomas jumped. The rattle struck the table. Doc. Jonas moved to the window instantly. Darkness swallowed the valley. But the lantern on the road had grown closer. 2 now. Maybe 3. Mara spoke quietly behind him. They are searching. Jonas did not turn. His eyes stayed fixed on the moving lights. How long before they reached the gate? Before dawn. The stove hissed softly. Fire settling lower. Thomas climbed back into the chair. His small hands wrapped around the rattle again. Doc. Doc. The sound came slower now. Almost thoughtful. Jonas stepped back from the window. The room felt warmer than before. But the warmth no longer felt safe. He reached for the rifle leaning against the wall. Metal clicked softly as he checked the chamber. The sound echoed through the quiet house. Thomas watched him carefully. Are they bad men? Jonas looked at the boy. Yes. The answer came simple. Bible simple. Mara stood beside the stove. Firelight dancing across her face. They will not stop until they take him. Jonas nodded once. Outside, the lantern lights drifted closer through the darkness. Hooves thudded faintly along the road. Inside the ranch house, the cedar rattle sounded again. Doc. Doc. Steady. Patient. Like a small heartbeat waiting for the storm. Night settled deep over the ranch. Cold air slid under the door and crawled across the floorboards. The stove burned low. Orange light flickered against the walls like restless shadows. Jonas Hale sat in the chair beside the table. The rifle rested across his knees. Metal cool against his hands. Across the room, Thomas slept beneath the blanket near the stove. Small breaths. Slow. The cedar rattle lay beside his fingers. Silent for now. Mara stood near the window. The dark valley stretched beyond the glass. Nothing moved. But the silence felt wrong. Too tight. Too waiting. The loose chain at the well tapped softly in the wind. Clink. Pause. Clink. Jonas watched the door. Listening. The boy shifted in his sleep. The rattle rolled once. Doc. Jonas closed his eyes briefly. Then the sound came. Distant hooves. Slow. Measured. Approaching from the south road. Jonas stood. The chair legs scraped the floor. The sound seemed loud in the quiet house. Mara did not turn. "They are here." Jonas moved to the door. He opened it slowly. Cold night air rushed inside. Darkness covered the valley. But lantern light bobbed along the road. 3. No. 4. The riders moved through the gate without stopping. Hooves thudded across the yard. Dust stirred beneath the lantern glow. Jonas stepped onto the porch. The boards creaked beneath his boots. Behind him the door stayed open. Warm firelight spilled into the night. The riders stopped before the steps. The lead horse snorted. Leather creaked as a man swung down from the saddle. Victor Crowley stepped forward. Tall. Clean coat. Black gloves. The lantern light caught the silver buckle at his belt. His boots touched the dirt with quiet confidence. Crowley looked around the yard slowly, studying everything. Then his eyes rested on Jonas. "So." His voice came smooth. "This is the place." Jonas said nothing. Crowley walked closer. Spurs jingled softly with each step. Cold wind moved between them. "Jonas Hale." He spoke the name like he owned it. Jonas remained still. Crowley glanced toward the open door. Firelight flickered inside. Warm. Alive. A faint sound drifted out. "Doc." "The rattle." Crowley smiled slowly. "There it is." Jonas stepped forward, blocking the doorway. Crowley's eyes met his. "You always were stubborn, Hale." Jonas spoke at last. "You always were greedy." One of Crowley's men laughed behind him. Crowley lifted a hand slightly. The laughter stopped. Silence returned. Cold and sharp. Crowley turned his head slightly. "Bring the paper." One of the riders dismounted. Leather creaked. He handed Crowley a folded document. Crowley held it up in the lantern light. The paper snapped softly in the wind. "This land now belongs to my company." Jonas shrugged. "Paper don't plow fields." Crowley smiled again. "No." He folded the paper slowly. "But it moves men." Behind him 2 riders shifted their horses closer to the house. Hooves thudded against the dirt. Mara stepped into the doorway behind Jonas. Crowley noticed instantly. His smile sharpened. "Ah." He tipped his hat slightly. "The traveler." Mara's eyes stayed steady. "You ride far for a child." Crowley's gaze flicked past her into the house. The stove cracked softly inside. Warmth flickered across the floorboards. And then the sound came again. "Doc. Doc." Crowley's smile widened. "Yes," he said quietly. "I do." Jonas's grip tightened on the rifle. Crowley noticed. "You won't shoot." Jonas said nothing. Crowley stepped closer to the porch. His boots pressed into the dirt. "We both know you buried that life years ago." The wind lifted dust across the yard. Cold brushed across Jonas's face. Behind him Thomas stirred. The rattle knocked softly against the table. "Doc." Crowley heard it clearly. "There's the proof." He looked at Jonas again. "That boy inside carries something that belongs to me." Jonas shook his head slowly. "No." Crowley's voice cooled. "You misunderstand." He pointed toward the door. "That brand." Jonas felt the words hit hard. Crowley continued. "That mark opens the last valley in the territory." Silence stretched between them. Crowley's men shifted impatiently. One horse stamped the ground. The sound cracked through the night. Jonas spoke quietly. "You rode all this way for a toy." Crowley's smile vanished. "For a legacy." He stepped onto the first porch step. The wood creaked under his weight. Jonas lifted the rifle. The metal clicked. Crowley stopped. The yard went silent again. Even the wind paused. Crowley studied the barrel calmly. 3 men behind me," he said softly. "And more coming with sunrise." Jonas did not lower the rifle. Crowley continued. "You cannot win this." Inside the house, Thomas's small voice carried out. "Jonas?" The word hung in the cold air. Crowley's eyes lit with interest. He took one slow step backward off the porch. "Tomorrow morning," he said. His voice returned to calm. "You hand the boy over." Jonas did not move. Crowley turned toward his horse. Spurs jingled softly. "If not." He paused beside the saddle. The lantern light flickered across his face. "I burned the ranch." The riders mounted again. Hooves shifted. Leather creaked. Crowley looked back once more at the house. Warm light glowing in the doorway. Then at Jonas. "You had your quiet life, Hale." He climbed into the saddle. "But it's finished now." The riders turned toward the road. Lantern light bobbed away into the dark valley. Hooves faded slowly into the distance. Jonas remained on the porch. Cold air wrapped around him. Inside the house, the stove popped softly. Warmth breathing through the room. Thomas stepped to the doorway. The cedar rattle in his hand. "Doc. Doc." The sound echoed across the silent yard. And Jonas Hale finally understood. The war had arrived at his door. Dawn came cold. Frost silvered the pasture grass. The ranch house breathed smoke from the chimney. Inside, the stove burned strong. Wood popped softly. Warmth pushed back the night. Jonas Hale stood at the window. Rifle resting against his shoulder. Eyes on the southern road. The valley lay quiet. But the quiet felt thin. Like ice over deep water. Behind him, Thomas sat at the table. The cedar rattle rolled between his palms. "Doc. Doc." Mara stood beside the stove. Her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee. Steam curled upward. Her eyes stayed on Jonas. "Sun is rising," she said. Jonas nodded once. The light crept over the hills slowly. Gold against the frost. Then the sound arrived. Hooves. Many. Heavy. Jonas lifted the rifle. Outside, the dust rose fast along the road. 6 riders now. No lanterns this time. No patience. The gate burst open under the first horse. Hinges shrieked loud in the morning air. Hooves thundered across the yard. Jonas stepped onto the porch. The boards creaked under his boots. Behind him, the house glowed warm. Thomas stood in the doorway. Small. Silent. The rattle hanging in his hand. Victor Crowley rode at the front. Black coat. Silver buckle. Eyes sharp beneath the brim of his hat. He stopped his horse 10 paces from the steps. The others spread wide across the yard. Cutting off the pasture. Crowley smiled thinly. "Well." His voice carried easy in the morning air. "Time to make a sensible choice." Jonas rested the rifle across the porch rail. "You rode early." Crowley shrugged. "I dislike waiting." One of his men circled the well slowly. Another moved near the barn. Hooves crushed the frost. The sound cracked through the cold silence. Crowley leaned forward slightly in the saddle. "The boy." Jonas did not move. "No." Crowley sighed softly. "I hoped you'd say that." He raised a hand. 2 riders dismounted. Boots hit the ground. Spurs jingled. They began walking toward the porch. Jonas lifted the rifle. The metal clicked sharp. The riders froze. Crowley smiled again. "You buried that gun 10 years ago." Jonas spoke quietly. "Some things wake up." The wind pushed across the yard. Cold. Hard. The loose well chain clanged once. Clink. Thomas shifted behind Jonas. The rattle tapped the doorframe. "Doc." Crowley's eyes flicked toward the sound. "There it is again." He stepped off his horse slowly. boots crunching frost. He walked toward the porch alone. Jonas tracked him with the rifle. Crowley stopped at the bottom step. The two men studied each other. "Crowley," Jonas said. "Leave." Crowley chuckled softly. "You're standing between me and an empire." Jonas shrugged. "Find another valley." Crowley shook his head. "No other valley carries that brand." He pointed toward the rattle. Jonas felt the words like a hammer. Behind him, Thomas gripped the cedar toy tighter. "Doc," Crowley continued calmly. "That mark unlocks the final land charter." He lifted a folded document from his coat. Paper rustled in the wind. "The county will recognize the bloodline." Jonas's jaw tightened. "You talk like you already own it." Crowley stepped closer. "I will." Behind him, one rider moved toward the barn. Another toward the well. Spreading. Closing. Mara stepped onto the porch beside Jonas. Her voice cut clean through the morning air. "The boy stays." Crowley studied her calmly. "You crossed half the desert to hide him." Mara did not blink. "I crossed it to return him." Crowley smiled again. "That was your mistake." The wind gusted suddenly. Dust swirled across the yard. A horse snorted loudly. Jonas felt the moment stretch thin. Then one of Crowley's men rushed forward, hand reaching for the porch rail. Jonas fired. The rifle cracked like thunder. The man fell backward into the frost. Silence exploded across the yard. Crowley's smile vanished. Gunfire erupted instantly. Shots slammed into the porch posts. Wood splintered. Mara pulled Thomas behind the doorway. The rattle struck the floor. "Doc." Jonas fired again. Another rider spun from his saddle. Horses screamed. Hooves pounded wildly across the yard. Crowley dove behind the well. Gunshots snapped through the morning air. Jonas worked the rifle steady. Click. Fire. Click. Fire. Each shot sharp as judgment. One rider fled toward the gate. Another dragged the wounded man away. The yard filled with dust and smoke. Then silence fell again. Only two men remained standing. Crowley beside the well. And Jonas on the porch. The wind moved softly through the broken fence. Crowley rose slowly. Hat gone. Hair loose across his face. "You just started a war." Jonas lowered the rifle slightly. "You brought it." Crowley's hand rested near his pistol. His eyes flicked once toward the house. Toward the boy. Then back to Jonas. The valley held its breath. Cold sun rising higher over the hills. Crowley slowly backed toward his horse. "This isn't finished." Jonas did not answer. Crowley mounted quickly. The remaining rider followed. Hooves pounded across the yard. The gate slammed open again. Dust swallowed them as they rode hard down the road. Silence returned. Broken. Gun smoke drifted across the porch. Jonas stood still, breathing slow. Behind him, the house creaked softly. Thomas stepped back into the doorway, the cedar rattle in his hand. "Doc. Doc." The sound echoed gently through the quiet ranch. And the valley knew the line had been drawn. Smoke drifted slowly across the yard. The morning wind carried it through the broken gate. Cold sunlight spilled across the porch. Jonas Hale stood still with the rifle hanging loose in his hand. The frost had melted where the horses ran. Boot prints and hoof marks cut the dirt in wild circles. The body of Crowley's man lay near the fence, a coat thrown over his face. Silence pressed down heavy on the ranch. Behind Jonas, the house creaked softly. Warm air pushed through the open doorway. And the cedar rattle sounded again. "Doc. Doc." Jonas turned slowly. Thomas stood just inside the door. Small hands wrapped around the wooden handle. His eyes searched Jonas's face. "Is it over?" Jonas stepped inside. The porch boards creaked under his boots. Not yet. The stove burned strong again. Fire cracked inside the iron belly. Warm light pushed against the cold morning. Mara knelt beside the table, cleaning blood from Jonas's sleeve. The cloth moved slow across the torn fabric. Jonas had not noticed the wound until now. The bullet had grazed him. A shallow burn across his arm. The cloth pressed harder. Jonas did not flinch. Outside, a crow called from the fence post. Harsh. Lonely. Thomas climbed into the chair beside the table. The rattle rested against the wood. Doc. The small sound echoed softly. Mara finished tying the cloth around Jonas's arm. "You will live," she said quietly. Jonas nodded once. His eyes stayed on the boy. "You said Crowley wanted him for the brand." Mara stood slowly. The room grew quiet again. Only the fire speaking now. She reached for the leather strip on the table. The burned cattle mark faced upward. Jonas's brand. His family's mark. She placed it beside the rattle. Doc. The two sounds touched each other. Wood against leather. Jonas stared at them. Mara's voice came low. "Crowley knows what this mark means." Jonas folded his arms. "It means cattle." Mara shook her head. "It means blood." The fire popped sharply. Thomas watched them both, confused. Jonas felt something heavy settle in his chest. "What blood?" Mara stepped toward the boy. Her hand rested on his shoulder. "Your blood." Jonas frowned. "My son died 10 winters ago." Mara met his eyes. "Your son did not die that night." The room fell silent. Even the fire seemed to pause. Jonas's voice hardened. "I buried him." Mara nodded slowly. "You buried a grave." The words hung between them. Jonas felt the old memory rise. Cold. Sharp. The night of fire. The raid. Smoke and shouting. The small body wrapped in cloth. The brand carved into the cedar rattle. He had buried it with the boy. Jonas looked down at the toy. The rattle rested against the leather brand. "Doc." His breath caught. "That rattle was in the grave." Mara spoke gently. "No." She crouched beside Thomas. Her hand brushed his hair. "The night Crowley's riders came to our village. They carried a child." Jonas's pulse pounded in his ears. "From where?" Mara's eyes stayed steady. "From your ranch." Jonas felt the room tilt slightly. "They stole him?" "Yes." "Why?" Mara lifted the leather strip again. "This brand marks the founder of the valley. Jonas's father. The first Hale to settle the land. His mark had opened the territory decades ago." Mara continued. "Crowley learned the law tied to that mark. The last blood heir holds the final claim to this valley." Jonas stared at Thomas. The boy's face carried dust and sunlight. But something else too. A line of the jaw. A shape in the eyes. Something painfully familiar. Thomas lifted the rattle again. "Doc." The sound struck Jonas like thunder. Mara's voice softened. "Your son lived." Jonas whispered hoarsely. "And Thomas?" Mara nodded. "Your son's son." The room fell silent again. The fire cracked. The wind brushed against the door. Jonas felt his legs weaken slightly. He pulled the chair out slowly. Wood scraped across the floor. He sat. Eyes locked on the boy. "My grandson." Thomas looked confused. "Grandson?" Jonas nodded slowly. "Yes." The boy steadied him carefully. Then smiled a little. The rattle tapped the table again. "Doc." Jonas felt tears threaten for the first time in 10 years. He cleared his throat roughly. "Crowley knew this?" Mara answered quietly. "He has searched for the boy for 2 years." Outside, the wind carried a distant sound again. Hooves. Far off. Crowley riding for more men. Jonas heard it instantly. The threat had not ended. But the truth had arrived. Jonas stood slowly. He placed his hand on Thomas's shoulder. Warm. Real. Alive. "My grandson," he said again. Thomas lifted the rattle proudly. "Doc." The sound echoed through the warm house. And Jonas Hale finally understood what he had been protecting all along. Spring arrived slow across the valley. Snowmelt ran thin along the creek behind the barn. Grass pushed through the frost in soft green patches. The ranch no longer sounded empty. Hammers struck wood near the corral. Clang. Pause. Clang. Jonas Hale drove another nail into the fence rail. The post stood straighter than the last one. He leaned back and wiped sweat from his brow. Morning sunlight warmed the pasture. A horse snorted nearby. Behind him small boots thudded through the grass. "Grandpa." Jonas turned. Thomas ran across the yard holding the cedar rattle high in the air. "Doc. Doc." The sound bounced bright in the warm wind. Jonas caught the boy easily when he reached him. Lifted him once. Set him back down. "You'll scare the horses." Thomas grinned. "They like me." Jonas glanced toward the pasture. The gray mare lifted her head and flicked her ears. She seemed to agree. Near the porch Mara hung a blanket along the rail. The cloth snapped softly in the breeze. Warm sunlight rested across her shoulders. She watched the two of them with quiet eyes. The house behind her looked different now. The broken boards had been replaced. Fresh timber shone pale along the walls. Smoke curled steady from the chimney. Life had returned to the place. Jonas walked with Thomas toward the porch. Boots pressed softly into the thawing ground. The boy kept tapping the rattle as they moved. "Doc. Doc." Jonas had once hated that sound. Now it followed him like music. They reached the steps. The porch boards creaked under their weight. The sound no longer echoed lonely. It blended with voices. With work. With living. Jonas sat in the chair beside the door. The same chair that once faced 10 years of silence. Thomas climbed into the other one. The rattle rested in his lap. Mara stepped inside and returned with a kettle. Steam drifted into the sunlight. She poured coffee into 3 cups. The cups clicked gently against the table. Jonas wrapped his hands around the warm tin. Heat spread into his fingers. The wind carried a faint distant sound from the road. Hooves. Jonas's eyes lifted instantly. Old habit. Old warning. Thomas noticed. "Is it Crowley?" Jonas listened carefully. The sound faded again. Just travelers. Or cattle moving across the far valley. Still. The memory of that morning never truly left. Jonas relaxed slowly. Not today. Mara sat beside him. Her hand brushed the porch rail. The wood was new. Strong. "Crowley will not return," she said. Jonas nodded. The county marshal had arrived 3 weeks after the fight. Paper in hand. Witnesses in tow. Crowley's empire had begun to crack once the truth of the valley's claim reached town. A stolen child. A forged charter. Land bought with blood instead of law. Crowley had fled west with what men remained. The valley belonged to the Hale bloodline again. And the bloodline now sat beside him. Thomas lifted the rattle again. "Doc." Jonas smiled. "You like that thing?" The boy nodded proudly. "It was yours." Jonas studied the toy. The burn mark on the handle. The same mark his father once carved. A brand older than the ranch. Older than the valley. A legacy carried in wood and memory. Mara leaned back in the chair. The wind moved her braids gently. "You kept the valley alive," she said. Jonas shook his head slowly. "No." He glanced at Thomas. "He did." The boy tapped the rattle again. Doc. Doc. Jonas listened to the sound. No longer a reminder of loss. No longer a ghost knocking from the past. Just a child's toy in the sunlight. The pasture horses moved lazily beyond the fence. The creek whispered softly behind the barn. Birds called from the cottonwoods. Noise filled the ranch again. Warm. Living. Jonas leaned back in his chair. The porch creaked beneath him. 10 winters of silence had ended here. In the same place. With the same small sound. Thomas slid off the chair and ran toward the yard again. The rattle bounced in his hand. Doc. Doc. The sound faded across the grass as he chased the gray mare along the fence. Jonas watched him go. Mara rested her hand over Jonas's scarred one. Warm skin. Steady. Your house is full again, she said softly. Jonas looked across the valley. The sun sat high above the hills. Golden. Bright. Where cold winds once ruled the land. Now laughter carried across the pasture. And somewhere near the barn the cedar rattle knocked gently against the fence rail. Doc. Doc. The sound of the Hale legacy continuing. If this story stirred a memory or two, saddle up with us again, hit subscribe and help keep these old frontier tales alive. Out here, every name, every trail, every sunset still matters. So till we meet again, friend, keep your hat tipped to the past, and your heart pointed west.